This is a true story. Actually, that's not true. It's a collection of true stories. Some are mine, some belong to others. In telling parts of my story, I am able to tell parts of other stories that would otherwise be untold, and they deserve to be told. While all these stories are true, they are not necessarily the whole truth. In my decades of work as a journalist, historian, biographer and playwright, I know this to be true. There is no such thing as the whole truth. And I would never claim my truth or my history to be that of anyone else. These stories contain the truth as I lived it, alone and with others. Some are named here, some are not. The stories are as I wrote them then and now, and as I viewed them through my own lens then and now, as a participant and a witness. And, like all witnesses, I can only testify to what I saw and knew and experienced. These histories were shared and connected, and collectively form that mosaic of experience which comprises the curate's egg of an entity we call the past. We revisit it subjectively and selectively, as is our nature and our right. The quest for objectivity is as problematic as the quest for truth. Ultimately, it might prove to be a futile quest for many of us, but that doesn't make it any less noble or worthwhile. The stories must be told. There is a Hopi Native American proverb which says, "Those who tell the stories rule the world." And women have to change the narrative of who rules the world by telling our story. This part of my story begins with an entry from my diary. January the 10th, 1975. I got the part of Miss Prism in The Importance of Being Earnest. This referred to an abridged version of Wilde's classic comedy that would form part of an evening of dance and drama at my secondary school in March 1975. Most of the cast were in the year above me, the lower sixth, and being cast in a school play was one of the rare happy events in my life at that time. And let us not underestimate the agony that ensues when you are 14 and begin to realise there is a major difference between you and the other girls in your circle. And it's got nothing to do with your superior spelling or encyclopedic general knowledge. And there's no one you can tell the truth to. That you are, potentially, possibly, probably, one of them. Most of the girls I was friends with didn't stay on into the sixth form, so from late 1975 onwards, I became part of a tight-knit nucleus of friends who were mostly older than me, and mostly, I sensed, with some indefinable otherness about them. The two I grew closest to were Neil and Paul, who had both been in earnest with me, and we teamed up again for a second school production, the ghostly melodrama The Monkey's Paw, that we started rehearsing February that year and performed in the April. Outside of this immediate circle of school was my beloved friend Dawn, who had befriended me at middle school, attended a different secondary school, and lived in a better part of town than the rest of us put together, Wimbledon Hill. I so wanted to be like her. Worldly, mature beyond her years, happy-go-lucky, and a talented self-taught guitarist whose musical tastes, Van Morrison, Lou Reed, Joni Mitchell, were a revelation to me. I even coveted her bedroom with its soft lights, joss sticks and embroidered cushions inlaid with tiny mirrors. Being her friend also opened my eyes to the first kind of prejudice I ever witnessed firsthand: anti-Semitism. At middle school, some of my other friends had snarled, "Why do you want to go around with that Jewish girl?" My first visit to Neil's house, our respective homes were only about 10 minutes walk apart, was to attend his 18th birthday party 3 days after we performed The Monkey's Paw. Apparently, I bought him a mirror and got home about 2:30 a.m. My diary entry fails to record why I chose to buy a mirror for him. It was to be the first of many joyous, drunken evenings we spent at each other's houses. Cheap booze, paid for by our Saturday jobs. Cider, Cinzano red, vodka, acid spumante, Matthias Rosé, which were all considered décivist back then. And there was lots of dancing and experimental, but sexless, adolescent snogs. Despite 1976 being a year of pain and major domestic dramas and upheaval to me, it was also a year that brought a feast of fun and forged bonds of friendship so strong they would eventually help us haul each other through pivotal years to come. However, at the end of that school year, all of my fellow others left. Paul to be a guard on the Northern Line and Neil to train as a nurse. We kept in touch, but attending school without them was dull and empty and academically largely pointless. I limped through until Friday, June the 17th, when I took my Latin paper 4 and then left for the last time, without any fanfare or farewells. I formed new circles of friends, mostly female, whom I met through my Saturday jobs and then my year at Secretarial College. But I was certainly not ready to reveal to them, did they ever suspect, that there was definitely a certain je ne sais quoi missing from our intimacy. Neil's first year as a student nurse in 1976 saw him based at Memorial Hospital, Shooters Hill, a geriatric hospital. It wasn't possible to phone him there, so we kept in touch by letter. He was obsessed with Marilyn Monroe, so it was no surprise she popped up in one of his earliest letters. October the 12th, 1976. Dear Rose, have you read about that Marilyn Monroe film, Goodbye Norma Jean? I must go and see that when it comes round, though I've read that it's rubbish. I still want to see it. That girl who plays Marilyn looks more like Stephen in drag than anything else. Stephen was a former schoolmate for whom we had no great fondness. Been to any wild parties lately? That's what I think I need, to go to a few really mad parties and live it up. Well, I hadn't actually, not really, and most of my letters probably spoke of college and how, much to my surprise, I was really enjoying it and doing well in my studies. Far better than I had it at school. Occasionally his letters would take a more serious tone. December the 11th, 1976. Today I started off by washing my first corpse, a thing which I really don't want to do again. The nurse I was working with left me alone behind the curtain and I was imagining all sorts of things. I had to really force myself to touch it. I was expecting it to move or something, and for one awful moment I thought it started breathing again. While I continued at further education college, learning to type and file and such like, Neil continued his training at Bexley Hospital, but he was still able to visit me almost weekly. If he was back for a weekend, we would see each other at least once, at each other's houses or for mini pub crawls. Pub crawls were the favoured rites for youthful birthday celebrations back then. Our favourite haunt was the Crooked Billet up on Wimbledon Common, but there was also the Leather Bottle, the Horse and Groom, the Grove, the Alexandra, the Brewery Tap, the Emma Hamilton, and the Prince of Wales, which in 1981 would make the front page of the local paper. A bar for homosexuals is to open at a bar in Wimbledon Town Centre tonight. Kill shock. I had my first jelly baby at the Crooked Billet. It was a drink Neil introduced me to. A lethal concoction of Pernod, blackcurrant and lager, which gives me a headache just reading that. When Neil and I weren't pubbing it, we would play tennis or go for long walks on Wimbledon Common, finishing up with a visit to Dave Earl's ice cream parlour. Or we'd go for occasional sightseeing days up in London, the British Museum, St Paul's, the London Dungeon and Oxford Street. There would be innumerable visits to each other's houses, mostly mine, as I've been living on my own since 1976. Well, that's a whole other story. If we listened to albums, they would be by the likes of Talking Heads or Bowie or Elton John or Manhattan Transfer, all flavoured with more than a soupçon of camp. Hell coincidence. But mostly it was singles. Disco, disco, funk, disco, soul, northern soul and disco. Yeah, we enjoyed punk and new wave, but it was mostly black artists who were giving our circle of white suburban kids the soundtrack to their lives. Oh, how we danced. Dance, dance, danced. Yowza, yowza, yowza. Not always wisely, but actually quite well. We salute you, Donna Summer. It was so good, so good, so good, so good. Dan Hartman, you set our lips on fire. Gibson Brothers, the first time we heard you, we knew it was love. War, you took us to your place in space. Gloria Gaynor, we grew strong and we learned how to get along. Chic, there was big fun to be had by everyone. High tension, that's what we are, superstar. Starguard, and now we think we know which way is up. And then there was Sylvester. The secret thrill of seeing that 6'4" black queen on top of the pops, sashaying down a flight of stairs, singing Mighty Real to rock our suburban white world. It was sexy, insistent, full of the promise of good times, and behind it was his message to be out, loud and proud. For me, it superseded Bowie's iconic arm-round Ronno moment on top of the pops in 1972. So it was no coincidence that the vile Death to Disco movement consisted entirely of white, straight men. Throughout 1978, Neil continued his nurse's training, and I went to work as an office temp to support myself and my true ambitions to become a recording and stage artist. In irritatingly precocious fashion, I've been writing my own songs since I was 13 and taught myself guitar at 15. I joined 2 theatre groups, the politically aware Forum Youth Theatre, based in North West London, and Group 64, which practised Stanislavski's methods of acting. That took up 3 evenings a week. At work, where there was often very little for me to do, I spent most of my time applying for theatre jobs, writing lyrics, planning my demo tape, which I was saving up to record. And from October 1979, I began going to various weekly workshops at Oval House. I was raw and untrained, but clearly a lot more confident than I remember being at the time. I managed to get an improbably varied number of interviews and auditions with established companies. Broadside Theatre, Common Stock, Covent Garden Community Theatre, Mouth and Trousers, Counteract, Bubble Theatre, the Old Vic Youth Theatre, Half Moon Young People's Theatre, and Demolition Decorators. Neil helped me rehearse my audition pieces, read my lyrics, listened as I played my songs, and even loaned me his typewriter when mine broke while I was writing my first play. Then, in late 1978, fate took a hand. Or rather, Paul did. Thursday, September 21st. Went to Leather Bottle with David, Paul, Roger and Frida. Got mildly drunk. Paul told me what I had long suspected. What I had long suspected was that Paul was gay. That the aforementioned Roger was his boyfriend, and they were buying a house together. He didn't do things by half measure. He told his family, his friends, and even his fiercely heterosexual colleagues on the Northern Line. Even as I write this, I'm still in awe of his courage. It wasn't the best of times for gay men to come out then, but then when was it ever? Queer bashing, the threat of blackmail, being lesbian or gay still classified as a mental illness, murders that were never properly investigated, let alone solved, and police entrapment and harassment. As Tom Robinson sang ironically, there was much to prevent you feeling glad to be gay. Major films abounded with stereotypes and other negative, sometimes dangerous characters and plots, from Midnight Cowboy to Cruising. And we women still had, and did for many years, the tweedy long shadow cast over us by the stereotype of Sister George, so you didn't get much change out of any of it. It was somewhere around this time, and I'm damned if I know why my diaries don't say when, that Neil also came out and revealed he had become involved with a chap called Des. He was tall, dark and handsome, with piercing blue eyes, and usually clad in leather or denim. He was certainly charismatic, and I could see the attraction, but I sensed that on some level he was a bit of a rogue. As it turned out, he was a bit more than that. As I noted in my diary in late 1978, Des doesn't like Paul because he claims he's a Paki. Actually, Paul was Indian Portuguese, but in those days that particular word was a universal term of racist abuse, regardless of the target's ethnicity. It probably still is. And so it had come to pass that my two suspected others had both declared their otherness. And it was obvious I couldn't be far behind. Saturday, October 14th. Went to Paul's, had a long talk, and I told him what I've never, and perhaps could never, tell anyone else. He was surprised, and I was surprised that he was surprised. October 19th, 1978. Saw advert for musicians for Cunning Stunts Music Theatre in Time Out. Phoned immediately and made arrangements to meet and see them perform. Cunning Stunts were an all-woman theatre troupe. As Alison Hennigan wrote in Gay News, where could you find a tap-dancing spider, a donkey who plays the violin, bionic women wrestlers and syncopated kneecaps? Where indeed? I decided that's where I needed to be. This took me to the Oval House for the first time. How to describe the Oval House back then? For me, it was my drama school, my university, my political school and my community centre. The Unfinished Histories Project has described it as a magnificent creative melting pot. Companies such as Caboodle, Lumiere and Son and Gay Sweatshop would hang out, watch each other's rehearsals, socialise in the Ophel Cafe or neighbouring pubs. And I was soon to become part of that melting pot. Saturday, 21st October. Neil and I went to see Cunning Stunts' Ham Fat on the Turn. Very, very funny indeed, totally different to anything I'd ever seen before. This was a total understatement. One of my enduring images from that show is of Iris Walton lighting a match by striking a piece of sandpaper that was sewn into the crotch of her costume. Neil sent me a good luck card for my audition a few days later, which made me teary. Lackaday and Rue, it didn't help. I did a pretty awful audition, but the stunts were very kind to this unseasoned but bold applicant. And I was about to get even bolder. Sunday, 22nd October. Neil and I arrived at Paul's at about 3 p.m. We went with him, Des and Roger to see Wordies Out at the Scala. Very moving and very funny in parts. Now, Wordies Out was the first real gay positive movie which showed that you could indeed be a happy homosexual and, most important, a delighted dyke. There was no going back after the film. Went to Coleherne in Earls Court Road, gay male pub, and I was one of about 4 girls there. Felt safe for the first time in a pub. I told Neil, and he told me about his brother Ian, who we met on the way back. We went back to my place afterwards. What Neil had told me about his brother Ian is that he was also gay. And confronted with this trio of revelations, their deeply Catholic mother commented, in all seriousness, "Did you all catch it off each other?" That memorable occasion wasn't to be my last visit to the Coleherne, then the most famous gay pub in London, and possibly England. Much favoured by leather queens, it was frequented by all and sundry who squeezed around its large horseshoe-shaped bar, or, as was often necessary, spilled out onto the streets, sometimes to the annoyance of local residents, one of whom was a certain Lady Diana Spencer. I suppose it's possible I might have rubbed shoulders with some of the pub's famous and infamous patrons. Kenny Everett and Freddie Mercury and, alas, Dennis Nielsen. But I never recognised anyone of note. Fortunately, none of us were present during one of the many police raids that occurred in 78 and 79. Despite, or possibly because of its blacked-out windows and the street spillage, it was an easy target. Arrests took place outside the pub, and offences included obstruction, soliciting, importuning, and conspiracy to corrupt public morals. Some officers couldn't even be bothered to wait until they were on duty. In October 1977, David Trewin and Norman Seymour went for a spin in a Ford Cortina with the express intention to go to the Coleherne and wind up a few queers. Even the notorious Special Patrol Group got in on the act. Their stated purpose was to combat serious public disorder and crime that could not be dealt with by local divisions. When they launched a Moving On operation at the Coleherne on June the 20th, 1979, one patron, who had watched two men being arrested, yelled out, "You murdered Blair Peach!" On April 24th that year, Special Patrol Group officers were policing a protest by the Anti-Nazi League in Southall, during which demonstrator Blair Peach was struck on the head and died from injuries caused by blunt force trauma. Subsequent inquiries revealed that SPG officers carried a formidable variety of unauthorised weapons, including baseball bats, crowbars and sledgehammers. This was one force that you didn't want to be with you. But none of this deterred me and my friends. December 27th, 1978. Neil came round early in the evening, just when I was going to concentrate on watching The Wizard of Oz. He wanted to go to the Coleherne, so we went after the film. We stayed there for about an hour or so, and we reflected on the advantages of living in Earl's Court, in that it seems to be a much more lively place. There's more to do, and places seem to stay open later. January 3rd, 1979. Neil came round in the evening for an hour or so. He revealed that he is seriously thinking of giving up nursing, partly because of the erratic hours. He did indeed leave nursing that year and became a civil servant. We would have lots of forays into the gay nightlife we hoped would deliver the object of our respective romantic dreams. I had high hopes for the future, in all respects. January 17th, 1979. Neil came round and read my tarot cards. I still don't know what happened to that promised inheritance. Still, Neil and I had discovered a new playground, the Union Tavern in Camberwell. It was easy for us to get there. Northern Line to the Oval, then a bus or walk up Camberwell New Road. As the Union was generally a drag pub, it followed that most of those who went to the discos were gay men. But a few other girls did show up, at least on Thursdays. I was too nervous to venture out on my own to any women-only clubs and discos, like Spats or the Soul's Arms or, heaven forfend, the Gateways Club. I was convinced they would be full of those terrifying tweedy Sister Georges. These Union regulars definitely didn't fall into that category. Long hair, makeup, slacks rather than jeans or cords, and actual blouses rather than shirts. Week after week, dance after dance, I occasionally took to the floor without Neil, so I could try and make some sort of contact with them, a la Edwin Starr. But there never was eye to eye, or indeed any other sort of contact. Not a smile, not a nod. I cannot recall now when I first became aware of the existence of fag hags, but I really wish someone had enlightened me back then. It might have saved me a lot of grief and confusion. We still had plenty of visits to the Coleherne, and as we discovered, Earl's Court was pretty much homosexualist central at that time. Saturday, January the 20th, 1979. We went to the Coleherne, which was much too crowded, so we went to the Boltons, where we met Ian and his friends. It was also there that when I went into the loo, I discovered that there were two girls in the cubicle next to me. Anyway, we went to the Copacabana with Ian and co. It was £2 to get in for non-members, which included food, which to my mind was pretty reasonable. It was quite crowded, but not unpleasantly so. The decor is very good itself, as was the disco. It is frequented predominantly by gay males. I guess about 90% of the clientele tonight were male. There were one or two weirdo girls, not including me, including one in a black lame cat suit. Very whips and boots. The barman wore little shorts with braces, and the barmaids wore little schoolgirl skirts. One barman went round taking random photos, for blackmail purposes. Neil got picked up by some guy, and Ian told him off for leaving me on my own. The club closed at 1 a.m, so we hired a cab. The sum of this evening and experiences? Well, it was certainly different. And it wasn't too long before Neil had copped off again. February the 7th, 1979. Neil came round soon after I got home. He told me all about his latest, Roger, another Gemini, and he's 33. Now, for many years, W.H. Smith had refused to stock Gay News, so much of its readership came via subscriptions or dedicated individuals who sold it to patrons at pubs and clubs, usually at closing time as they were leaving. And from 74 to June 79, one of these was a chap called Roger, who covered many of the South West London venues, including the Union, the Boltons and the Coleherne. And at some point, his and Neil's paths crossed and they became an item. Neil and I were still going out regularly, perhaps too regularly, because the novelty was starting to wear off. May the 10th, 1979. The Union wasn't very crowded. I didn't feel much like dancing and just felt bored with the place. The same old exhibitionists doing their same little acts. I told Neil this and he seemed to agree. I don't think we'll be going there for a while. Other attractions were drawing my attention. That May, Neil and I went to a matinee performance of the original production of Bent at the Royal Court. Then, for my birthday, Neil, Roger and some other friends went to dinner and a show at the King's Head, bits of Lenny Bruce. But the biggest attraction for us in 1979 was our first Gay Pride March, or, to be precise, the Gay Pride Week Carnival on Saturday, June the 30th, marking the 10th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in New York. The parade was set to begin at 1 o'clock at Temple Place, ending at Hyde Park for Music in the Park with lots of people you've never heard of and some you have. These people included Tom Robinson and Polly Perkins. And who else was there, performing at my very first Gay Pride? Sylvester. That was mighty real. He had told Gay News, "We want the UK to remember us. I think they will." Sister, we surely did. There was also a small but eclectic programme of political and cultural events taking place across London. Performances by lesbian music duo Over, the Brixton Fairies performing their satirical show Minehead Revisited, and, the other side of the same coin, a discussion at Central London Poly on the political implications of the Thorpe trial. On the day of the march, the police heavily outnumbered the marchers, as was the norm then, and we hid our faces behind our pink gay pride balloons for fear of being photographed or filmed. Which, of course, we were. Saturday, June 30th. Bought jacket. Neil, Roger, Paul. March. Wimbledon Area Gay Society. Saw Mike, Dave, London Gay Teenage Group people. And Dawn! March was 1.5 hours to Hyde Park. Reunion with Dawn. Neither of us could believe it. Yeah, the last thing I would have expected to find on a Gay Pride March was my dear old friend Dawn, who I hadn't heard from for several years, and who I just knew wouldn't be gay. Indeed, she wasn't, but she was what would come to be known as a gay ally. A week after our joyful reunion, I wrote to her. "I really enjoyed the march. I thought the atmosphere was very friendly. Did you see the World in Action programme on Monday about it? We, Neil, Paul and co, narrowly avoided being projected nationwide by the ITV cameras. The group, Guildford Area Gay Society, just in front of us were filmed. It would have been hysterical if we had been filmed and my mum saw it. Can you imagine her reaction? Were you or anyone you know involved in the sit-in at the Guardian offices? I thought the article that prompted this action thoroughly deserved the berating it got. How did it manage to get editorial approval, I asked myself. The article and sit-in I was referring to was a snide, disparaging piece by Peter Cole in Weekend Watch in The Guardian, which many rightly took exception to. The article prompted not only letters of protest, but an actual sit-in protest at the paper's offices by 60 activists from groups including Lesbian Line, Sappho, the Gay Activists Alliance and Gay Switchboard. It was all heady stuff. And within weeks of this, July the 19th to be precise, there was another memorable first for me, a date with a woman, courtesy of a Time Out Lonely Hearts advert. It began so well, but it actually heralded the beginning of what turned out to be a painful, upsy-downsy, emotionally confusing 18 months as I became embroiled with a Kate Bush lookalike and her millionaire Malaysian boyfriend. I know, don't ask. The pain of it was only made bearable at the time by Neil's support, for his own romantic entanglements at that time were not without their traumas and dramas. This is just one of my many diary entries from that year which told their own story. All I needed was someone to listen. Went to Neil's place, talked, cried and comforted. I know there were some aspects of the gay male scene, sort of emotional shallowness for example, that Neil found not entirely to his liking. In those days, especially in the leather bars, many gay men took to wearing coloured hankies or bandanas in their left or right back pockets, different colours on different sides denoting sexual practice preferences. However, some gay men rebelled against what they saw as this meat rack approach to sex and started wearing small teddy bears in their pockets instead. Left side meant you were a cuddler, right, a cuddly. Now, Neil was never an overly sentimental or romantic person, but he loved the idea of the teddies, and being handy with woolen needles made several for himself and his friends, including me. Mine even had its own removable green scarf. It's still wearing it, sitting here on my desk. And so we left the seismic 70s and stepped eagerly into the enterprising 80s. The Oval House, its community, and the Brixton gay community had become respectively my second home and my second families. Via my Oval House connections, I started attending women in entertainment workshops, which in turn led to me being asked to participate in a benefit show organised by the female company Bloomers at the Rio on April the 27th, 1980. And, as was often the serendipitous case in those days, this led to me meeting Carol, Hilary and Eva, with whom I formed my first theatre company, Hardware. Until the end of June, when Hardware set out on a 2-month, 5-country busking tour around Europe, Neil and I spoke on the phone almost daily, and saw each other at least once a week. It was him I rang the day after I got back from the European busking tour, and I saw him about a week after my return. But things had changed. Me, him. How could they not have? Thereafter, we had only a few phone calls and visits in December that year. In 1981, a phone call at the beginning of the year and another at the end. Neither Neil nor I could have known then that, in helping me find the road that I should take, and was indeed taken, it was destined to take us down different roads so that our paths would never cross again. We were living in the decade which began cloaked in the sinister shadows of Thatcherism and Reaganomics and fossilised communism and the Willy-like cruise missiles they were waving at each other, and record rises in youth unemployment and swinging cuts in funding for the arts and urban police forces targeting the black and gay communities. Then, when those communities fought back, they blamed the riots on outside agitators and left-wing councils. For me, there was no separating the personal from the political, from the performing. Dance till you drop was becoming superseded by dance till they drop one. Most gay men seemed to hanker for nothing more than a quiet gay life as they came out of the bed sits and into the suburbs, courtesy of the secure job and the steady living lover. They wanted little more than to enjoy the regular holidays in Gran Canaria and Key West and Mykonos, organised by Uranian Travel, and weekends in Brighton and Blackpool, where it was okay to play away, and intimate dinners at Roy's Restaurant or Bonaparte's. It had become my habit to make a note in my diaries of significant political developments. Southall riot. Salt II agreement signed. Thorpe and Co. acquitted. Vote on capital punishment failed. Saw some national fronts in the Broadway. Wish I'd had my anti-Nazi League badge on. God, they make me sick. Since 1978, it had also become my habit to clip all my regular newspapers and magazines for cuttings of particular interest on gay rights, feminism, racism, alternative music and theatre, national and international politics, and file them away. They constituted the beginnings of a substantial private archive collected and augmented for the next 40 years and counting. So it was only natural that I would eventually gravitate towards those who were no longer content merely to make gay news. They were becoming more vocal and making gay noise, which frightened the horses and was perceived as a threat to the quiet life. Gays against racism, gays against the Nazis, gays against the bomb, gays against the Corrie Bill, gays against sexism, and eventually, of course, gays against Thatcher. The National Front and their counterparts, the British movement, were real and credible threats. As well as the Jewish community, they targeted the black and Asian communities, the gay communities, and anything they perceived to be left-wing. And here's the thing. The police did exactly the same. In the 1977 Greater London elections, National Front candidates in 2 East London constituency garnered 19% of the votes. Only concerted multiracial efforts, including by the likes of Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, halted the rise of the neo-Nazi groups and stymied their impact come the 1979 general election. But the thugs were still amongst us. On January the 27th, 1980, 20 men wearing NF badges stormed into the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, attacking customers and staff and causing extensive damage to the pub. In Brighton, in January 1979, a group of them had barged their way into a screening of Word Is Out, injuring several men. The local paper, the Argus, responded with a leader column basically saying it was all the gays' own fault. This resulted in 100 lesbians and gay men picketing the paper and getting it to agree to a retraction and a right of reply. The last postcard I ever had from Neil was in 1983, mailed from Anaheim, California. Dear Rose, Paul and I have decided to have a holiday in LA. It's all very exciting. I've seen Marilyn's footprints at the Chinese Theatre. Tomorrow night we're off to a Diana Ross concert at the Universal Theatre. And on Monday we're going to Mexico for a short trip. I think we'll need a holiday after this to recover. Lots of love, Neil. I'm not sure they made it to the Ross concert, but I know the Mexico trip didn't happen. Neil sent me that card on the 22nd of September. On that same day, 12,000 miles away, the vicissitudes of his life had become too much for his brother Ian, and he had decided to end it. He jumped under a Northern Line train in South London. His father, with whom he had been living, tracked Neil down, and he cut short his holiday. Ian became a coroner's case, of course, and his inquest was overseen by a certain Paul Knapman, who would preside over a number of notable and famous inquests, including the murder of Nanny Sandra Rivet, the Marchioness disaster, Princess Diana, and Alexander McQueen. But there was nothing infamous or controversial about Ian's inquest and cause of death. Only the stark, painful truth. Multiple injuries. Killed himself. Now, with all the visible menaces and enemies that threatened to engulf our world, how could Neil or I, or any of us, have envisaged that, lurking amongst us, sight unseen, was an adversary that would bring suffering, fear, prejudice and grief on an unimaginable scale? On July the 3rd, 1981, the New York Times ran a story. Rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals in New York and California. The rare cancer was Kaposi sarcoma, rare and aggressive. By September that year, the first KS clinic had opened in San Francisco, and 2 months later, 29-year-old Bobby Campbell became the epidemic's self-appointed KS poster boy. In the UK, Gay News ran its first article on this subject in November that year, a feature by 2 gay Canadian doctors published in Body Politic. The next month, the first known AIDS case in the UK was confirmed. A year later, the same Canadian doctors wrote another feature, and Gay News ran a story about this one too. These doctors opined that there is absolutely no evidence for the wildfire spread of AIDS or for the notion that the disease is spreading from gay men to heterosexuals. And they continued, lesbians and gay men are going to have their rights denied and infringed upon, all because 400 cases of a disease have appeared among 200 million of us. You might have heard some echoes of this attitude concerning another virus that is currently wreaking global havoc. Additionally, these doctors criticised the work of the New York-based Gay Men's Health Crisis for raising funds for research, saying such funds were wasted. However, in December 1982, Gay News photographer and reporter Bob Workman warned, one way or another, it seems we are going to hear a lot more about immune deficiency. He was right, and those Canadians were wrong. And then some. One of them died in 1987, cause unknown. The other in 1991 from HIV complications. In February 1983, Bent author Martin Sherman wrote, British gays and the British gay press haven't yet taken in that this plague constitutes a major event in gay history. Well, we soon would. By May 1983, there were 1,361 confirmed AIDS cases in the US, 520 of whom had died. In 1984, the US Health Secretary expressed a hope that an HIV vaccine would be available within 2 years. By the end of 1986, 85 countries had reported nearly 39,000 cases of AIDS to the World Health Organization. By 1995, 1 gay man in 9 in the US had been diagnosed with AIDS. 1 in 15 had died, and 10% of the 1,600,000 American men aged between 25 and 44 who identified as gay had died. By 2018, there were nearly 104,000 people in the UK living with HIV. Since the beginning of the epidemic, 76 million people have been infected with the HIV virus, and about 33 million people have died of HIV and AIDS. Historically speaking, I cannot remember another time, before or since, when a health crisis in this country was used as a socio-political weapon against the sector of the community most affected by that crisis. AIDS transformed my life forever, and I didn't even have it. I once wrote a piece that said that if you ignored the AIDS crisis, it would bite you on the backside one day. Well, I didn't ignore it, but it bloody well did anyway. I lost men I campaigned with, worked with, partied with. Most of them didn't make it to 40, let alone 50. The effect was as someone had taken a pair of scissors to my address books and photo albums. Many gay men could tell a depressingly similar story, but increasingly, so could many lesbians. And yet again, many of us stepped up, protesting, campaigning, counselling, volunteering, fundraising, writing, and mourning. By the time the virus had become a major health and social crisis, I had become a journalist, and the effects of the epidemic began to be reflected in my work. For instance, I wrote about the increase in homelessness amongst people with AIDS, mortgage companies insisting on HIV tests for same-sex couples, the effect of AIDS and HIV on women and on ethnic minorities, and all the films and books and TV dramas about AIDS. We were all living with AIDS now. In just 10 years, we'd gone from referencing our visits to the Bell and the Union and the Fallen Angel and the Drill Hall and the Black Cap and First Out Coffee Shop and the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, to referencing visits to hospital wards and wings. Brodripp, Jeffries, Charles Bell, Kobler, Thomas Macaulay, and of course the London Lighthouse. There were now less discussions about the potency and side effects of jelly babies and other alcoholic concoctions, and more about the side effects of Septrin, AZT, DDI, pentamidine, and acyclovir. January 1989. Sylvester dies, an early hero from my coming out days. I write his obituary for City Limits. I know it won't be the last one I write. Nearly 20 years passed by. No, they flew by, until the recent past became the distant past. Aptly, it was the now defunct website Friends Reunited which brought Paul and I together again. By then I had moved from London to Sussex, a road he too had taken some years earlier. We arranged to meet in a gay bar in Brighton, and on the phone he promised to tell you all about Neil. But his tone during that call told me something about Neil that I suspected and was confirmed. Yeah, Neil had died. Had been dead a long time, in fact, since 1989. He was one of 753 deaths from AIDS in the UK that year, and one of 2,590 since 1982. Apparently, Neil believed he caught the virus from an American guy he'd met at the Union who lived in New York, but who made frequent visits to London in the early 80s and started an affair with Neil during one of those trips. I cannot recall his name. Bill? Ken? What does it matter now? It was the virus with a small name that condemned them both to early, painful deaths. Neil had been a patient at St George's Hospital, Tooting, ironically the same hospital where I had my first temporary secretarial job. When it became clear he was dying, Paul asked if he wanted him to get in touch with me and maybe visit him. Neil said no. And I understand and respect that, now, and when I learned of it. He probably did me a favour. At that juncture, although I had seen pictures of patients afflicted by Kaposi sarcoma, as he was, I hadn't seen anyone in the flesh. And it was best I remember his face the way it is in my photos and my memories, and more recently my dreams, not ravaged by those brutal, unmistakable purple lesions. No poster boy status for him. Sheila Dutch, a worker at London Lighthouse, once wrote, "What is so frightening about KS is not recognising yourself. Also, when you get KS, that's it. You can't tell yourself you've cheated the virus." Even now, I am uncertain whether I could have held my emotions in check if I had seen Neil for the last time like that, while we were attempting to fill in the blanks of the last 6 years of our lives and reflect on those 6 years when we had been so much to each other. In the years to come, I was to witness the suffering of more friends and colleagues, not all of them with the same illnesses, which ranged from the pneumonia PCP to internal and external lesions, dramatic weight loss and muscle weakness. The main causes of Neil's death were raised intracranial pressure and Kaposi sarcoma. Aggressive KS was then afflicting a quarter of all AIDS patients, and inflammation of the brain, nearly 90% of them. As a former nurse, Neil would have been acutely and cruelly aware of the suffering to come once he was diagnosed, and especially once he entered hospital for the last time. I cannot be sure, but it's entirely likely that the ICP would have severely affected his sight and other neurological functions. The abject cruelty of it defies tolerance. Neil died in St George's, aged 31, on the 17th of September 1989, almost exactly 6 years after sending that last postcard to me from California, almost exactly 6 years after his brother's death, 6 years in which his father lost both of his sons. Tragedy upon tragedy, pain after pain. So much time had elapsed between Neil's death and my learning of it, I've come to realise that I never properly mourned him. I hadn't grieved for him, nor for the 6 years that we were absent from each other's lives, which turned out to be the last of his. Would those 6 years have superseded or matched our earlier 6 years in their importance, or their joy, or their love? I doubt it. It is those earlier 6 years, when our lives were so intertwined, that I mourn now, as well as the possibility of all the years that were stolen from him. It was only last year, by employing some of my old-fashioned investigative skills, that I located his last resting place. His ashes lie in a plot, together with his brothers, in the North East Surrey Crematorium communal lawns. I have vowed that one day, when I feel confident about making the journey in post-pandemic safety, I will visit and pay my respects to them both. It's the least I can do. I hope, in his last days, Neil remembered me with fondness. I hope he didn't suffer much, but the stark facts on the death certificate and my experiences tell me a different story. I hope his poor ravaged body wasn't washed by a scared, nervous student nurse who thought he might come back to life. I hope he would have been amused and impressed by my circuitous journey from musician to performer to journalist to author and back to performer again. I hope I was as important to him as he was to me during the closest years of our friendship. And I hope he knew he was. Because that's what I would have told him had I paid one last visit for one last dance. I would have taken his bear to see him. That token of affection and cuddling, created with love, given with love, and kept with love, which will be taken with me on my last journey. As Sappho, history's most famous lesbian, wrote, "Someone, I tell you, in another time, will remember us." It is another time, and I do remember. The last generation, there were many, not few, victimized by vilification. Sad to say, nothing new. We commemorate the lives of those we loved and lost. They all paid a painful price. We still count the cost. A terror with a tiny name, weaponized to render blame and shame. It's been with us for so many years, too much